Hello, here I am again in the name of the sovereign creator of heaven and earth, the Lord Jesus Christ. Having concluded my evaluation of the Westcott-Hort theory and three possible objections, last video I started to evaluate von Soden's treatment of his KR. Today I will conclude that evaluation, which will also conclude this series on my evaluation of New Testament textual criticism. Number 4, von Soden was obsessed with the adulterous woman passage. That's John 7:53 through 8:11. Apparently, he thought it would provide a key for the whole New Testament. He and his team collated over 900 manuscripts for those 12 verses. It's far more than for any other New Testament passage. He reduced those 900 manuscripts to 7 families or lines of transmission. He called them M, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The M being the first letter in adultery in Greek. On page 2 or 524, he offered a stemma wherein his M1 was closest to the source and M7 was the farthest from that source. The last 3 families, that's 5, 6, and 7, were by far the largest, any one of them being larger than the first 4 combined, so much so that any 2 of the 3 represented a majority of the total. Von Soden argued that his M7 was a composite based on his M6 and M5, and therefore was subsequent and inferior to them. Well, that's reminiscent of Hort's treatment of his Syrian text. However, Hort did produce 8 alleged conflations within his Syrian text and condemned it for the whole New Testament on that basis. Now then, a genuine conflation is by definition secondary, okay? That's if you can prove that the 2 shorter readings are not independent simplifications of the original longer reading. But in the pericope, M7 does not contain any conflations. So on what objective basis did von Soden claim that it was based on 6 and 5? Within the pericope, there are 32 variant sets that are relevant to the 3 large groups that I will now reproduce. I ask the reader to try to analyze the evidence without preconceived notions. The information offered below is based on Maurice Robinson's complete collation of 1,389 manuscripts that contain the pericope. That's John 7:53 through 8:11. I attempted to establish a profile of readings for each of the 3 main groups of manuscripts. That's M5, 6, and 7. Okay, now there you have the chart. I'm just going to let you look at it later at your leisure to analyze it with care. I'm now going to jump down to the end where I am going to comment on it now. There were 3 columns there, M7, M6, and 5. Okay. M7 has a single clear-cut, unambiguous profile or mosaic as defined by 127 manuscripts. There is not a single internal variation among them. That is to say, those 127 are precisely the same for all 12 verses. That contrasts dramatically with M6 and M5. It is possible to come up with a partial profile for both 5 and 6 for purposes of distinguishing them from each other and from M7. But they have so much internal variation that I see no way to come up with a family archetype that is objectively defined. I use the asterisk to distinguish between variants that might be called the backbone of the family for the purpose of distinguishing it from the others. As the reader can verify, 6 has internal division no less than 15 times out of the 32, which does not improve its credibility quotient, okay? 5 has only 4, so it is far less squishy than 6, but the nature of those 4 does not allow a single archetypal form. By the way, I did not include set 13 in the above because there is generalized confusion among the manuscript sets across all lines. Now then, attention please. 7 and 6 join against 5 14 times. 7 and 5 join against 6 9 times. 6 and 5 join against 7 not one single time. So, does this mean that 7 is dependent on 5 and 6, von Soden? Or does it mean that 5 and 6 are independent departures from 7? WNP, that's me. Only for set 23 are all three groups entirely distinct. But at least for this set, 7 does not depend on the other two, okay? Just by the way, curiously, the manuscripts present us with at least 7 different arrangements of the 5 words in set 23, and the main lectionary group goes with a 4th reading, not one of the big 3. That's curious. Okay, to continue, to my mind, 7 is the lowest common denominator and therefore older and better than the other 2. Okay, so what is the point? Well, the point is that M7 equals von Soden's KR, or my family 35. And the point is, he used his analysis of M7 to characterize his KR for the whole New Testament. He repeatedly offered M7 as proof that KR was late. Okay, anyone who is even remotely acquainted with the manuscripts knows that to characterize even one book, not to mention the whole New Testament, on the basis of 12 verses is just plain wrong. Since it is impossible to demonstrate objectively that M7 is dependent upon M6 and M5, that imagined dependency should not be alleged as being relevant to the age and nature of the text type. Okay? Going on, number 5. For some mysterious reason, von Soden seemed determined that his KR should have been created in the 12th century. So he exerted himself to redate the 3 KR manuscripts from the 11th century that he knew of. I have 11 of them, okay? But since the 3 are copies, not original creations, their exemplars were older. Of necessity, right? As were, of course, the exemplars of the exemplars and so on. Okay, so what did von Soden think he was proving? To his mind, apparently, a text type could not have existed before its earliest extant representative. Give me a break, okay? For many years, I have heard people repeating the evident stupidity that because there are no early Byzantine manuscripts, the Byzantine text cannot be early. And they're still doing it. But that is based on the obviously false assumption that the surviving manuscripts from the earliest centuries are representative of the total manuscript situation at that time. Look, the only surviving edifices in Egypt that are 4,000 years old are the pyramids, right? Okay, will anyone be so ridiculous as to argue that a pyramid was the only type of structure used in Egypt at that time? It's the only one we have today. How many Egyptians at that time lived in pyramids? Absolutely none, because pyramids were only for the dead. Okay. But did ordinary people get a pyramid for a tomb? Well, no, only a pharaoh could afford one. We can say with total certainty that pyramids are not representative of the totality of structures in Egypt 4,000 years ago, even though they are the only ones that have survived. I would say that it is equally certain that the earliest manuscripts are not representative of the manuscript situation at that time. I would say they are the resting place of dead forms of the New Testament text, just like the pyramid. Pardon that bit of humor. Going on, I do not know even the name of any of my great-great-grandfathers, and I have no artifacts that they used. Yet I can state with total certainty that they existed. Well, how can I do that? Well, I can do that because I'm here, because I exist. I could not exist without great-great-grandfathers, all right? My body contains some of their genes, their DNA. Just because I did not exist 400 years ago does not mean that none of my ancestors did. All right? Is that not perfectly obvious? In 1976, Dr. Jacob Van Bruggen published the Ancient Texts of the New Testament. It contains a chapter on the age of the Byzantine type that occupies pages 22 through 29. He marshaled a variety of arguments to show that the Byzantine text type must be older than its surviving representatives. I will limit myself to quoting just one paragraph, which is on his page 25. Quote, this is Van Bruggen. What conditions must be satisfied if we wish to award the prize to the older majuscules? While asking this question, we assumed, wittingly or unwittingly, that we were capable of making a fair comparison between manuscripts in an earlier period and those in a later period. After all, we can only arrive at positive statements if that is the case. Imagine that someone said, in the Middle Ages, mainly cathedrals were built, but in modern times, many small and plainer churches are being built. Well, this statement seems completely true when we today look around in the cities and villages. Yet we are mistaken, an understandable mistake. Many small churches of the Middle Ages have disappeared, and usually only the cathedrals were restored. Thus, a great historical falsification of perspective with regard to the history of church building arises. We are not able to make a general assertion about church building in the Middle Ages on the basis of these surviving materials. If we would still dare to make such an assertion, then we wrongly assume that the surviving materials enabled us to make a fair comparison. But how is the situation in the field of New Testament manuscripts? Do we have a representative number of manuscripts from the first centuries? Only if that is the case do we have the right to make conclusions and positive statements. Yet it is just at this point that difficulties arise. The situation is even such that we know with certainty that we do not possess a representative number of manuscripts from the first centuries. This is due to three reasons which now deserve our attention successively. By the way, the emphasis is in the original, if you're looking at it. Okay, so my end quote. Van Bruggen goes on to discuss those three reasons. I may say that I know him personally and that he is an authority on the subject of cathedral. He really is. He knows all about cathedrals. Okay. I continue to insist that most of the early manuscripts survived because they were intolerably bad. It was psychologically impossible to use them. Besides being a criminal waste of good parchment to copy them, all right? Just by the way, 06 is that not the only one that has an extant child? See, Aleph has no children, B has no children. A while ago, I collated cursive GA789. It's located in the National Library in Athens, the Greek National Library. I collated John, having already done so for Luke. Although the copyist made an occasional mistake, I judged that his exemplar was a very nearly perfect representative of family 35, that's in John. However, 789 is presently lacking John 19:12 to the end. A later hand, that would be 789's supplement, has 19:26 to the end. But that copyist was a terrible speller, averaging nearly one mistake per verse. That's reminiscent of Papyrus 66, although 66 is worse, averaging around 2 mistakes every verse. I found myself becoming angry with the copyist. I was prepared to call down curses on his head. Assuming that the cause of the mistakes was ignorance rather than perversity, the copyist should not have undertaken a task for which he was so pitifully unqualified. it would be psychologically impossible for me to use 789 supplement for devotion or study. I would become too angry to continue. I assume that sincere Christians in the early centuries would have reacted in the same way, or at least a similar way. Going on, strange to relate, the very INTF that Kurt Aland founded. Kurt Aland, he was the one who declared that the Byzantine manuscripts were irrelevant for the search for the original text. That INTF has now published the following quote. Since the Textus Receptus was overcome by the scholarly textual criticism of the 19th century, there is tenacious negative bias against the Byzantine majority text. Wherever well-known older textual witnesses like Vaticanus or Sinaiticus, and even more so in combination with the papyrus, stand against the majority of minuscules, the decision against the majority text was often made easily without seriously considering the quality of the variants in question. Therefore, the editors of the present edition have taken two factors as paramount. First, it is often overlooked that in the vast majority of variant passages, only a few witnesses differ from all the others. As a rule, the popular witnesses from the 4th, 5th, and 5th centuries, and effects from even earlier papyri, agree with the majority of all witnesses. This implies that at all these passages, the old age of the majority text is not in doubt. Second, it is necessary to distinguish consistently between a manuscript and the text transmitted in it. Essentiores non deteriores is a principle widely accepted in editing philology, but in New Testament scholarship, it was applied only to a few younger manuscripts featuring similar textual peculiarities as Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. For the reason given above, it is undoubtedly true that the textual tradition as a whole goes back to a very early period, and that the coherent transmission of the majority of all textual witnesses provides a strong argument for, not against, the variant in question. End quote. The emphasis in the original was their emphasis. I took this from page 30 of the recent 2017 Editio Critica Major for Acts. You can check it for yourself. Okay, so much for INTF. I say, well, better late than never. Quote, the textual tradition as a whole, end quote, includes Family 35 or KR of necessity, okay? Also, the Text und Textver series, that's put daraus by NTF, is now complete for the whole New Testament except for John chapters 11 through 21. The objective evidence it provides shows clearly, empirically, that Family 35, or KR, is independent of the Byzantine bulk that was Soden's KX. And that's throughout the New Testament. It follows that it cannot be a revision of that bulk. Anyone who continued to affirm that von Soden's KR was a revision of his KX is either uninformed or perverse. To ignore clear evidence that has been called to your attention and to continue to promote a claim that you know is false is to be perverse. Going on, we get point number 6, and this is the last one. It remains to take up the question of the liturgical apparatus characteristic of Family 35. A lectionary copy would be far easier and faster to produce than a full continuous text copy, quite apart from an apparatus in a different color. Since we have extant lectionaries from the 4th and all subsequent centuries, from the 4th century and all subsequent centuries, why would anyone go to the extra work of adding a liturgical apparatus to a continuous text copy? Why? And why was that apparatus added to only one text type? But first, why were lectionaries prepared anyway, instead of continuous text manuscripts? As the practice of reading and expounding established passages on specific Sundays became generalized, having to use a full text manuscript became cumbersome. Why not prepare manuscripts containing only the established sections? Recall that most people could not read and were limited to hearing scripture during the weekly meetings. Very few people were able to read and study the scriptures at home. Fewer still would be in a position to make written copies of anything. Scribe was a profession. However, I submit for the consideration of the reader that the very mentality that would consider a lectionary to be a good thing in itself represented a relaxing of a devout commitment to the precise form of the sacred text. It's for you to think about. From the 4th century on, if not before, the Roman Church used Latin, not Greek. So, who preserved the Greek text down during the Middle Ages? Increasingly, it would have been the Greek-speaking monastic communities. By definition, a monastery is a religious community. Its daily life and very existence derives from and depends upon its religion. There are others, not just Christian, you know that. For Christian communities, the New Testament writings would be central to their faith. However, as time went on, tradition took over, and there would be a relaxing of a devout commitment to the precise form of the sacred text. This would be reflected in the level of quality control that prevailed in each monastery with reference to the copying of New Testament manuscripts. It would also be reflected by the increased production of lectionaries instead of the continuous text in monastery. The relaxing of quality control in the copying of New Testament manuscripts is reflected in the variety of readings to be found among the manuscripts that make up the Byzantine tradition. For 3 chapters of Luke, Frederick Vissa identified 36 lines of transmission within the Byzantine tradition. There's just one more, and that was the Egyptian tradition. Okay, an average Byzantine manuscript will have 3 to 5 variants per page of a printed Greek text, as compared to 15 to 20 for an Alexandrian manuscript. That's per 1 page of printed text. But going back to the Byzantine, the monk was performing a religious duty. In monasteries, everybody has a duty. Right? Some were copyists. He's doing a religious duty, but without a personal commitment to the text. A merely ho-hum Family 35 manuscript will have 1 variant per 2 pages of printed text, printed Greek text, while the better ones will only have 1 variant per 3, 4 more pages printed text. Really good ones will be perfect for the shorter books. Like I have 29 perfect copies for Philemon and so on. I myself have collated a manuscript with just 1 variant for the 21 chapters of John. The same manuscript, which is GA 586, has just 1 variant for the 16 chapters of Mark. What does that picture tell us about the mentality of the copyists? How can we account for the extreme care demonstrated by the Family 35 copyists? The extant Family 35 or KR manuscripts come from isolated monasteries around the Mediterranean world and were produced during 5 centuries. That's 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. Now, I'm ignoring for the moment, of course, the generations of exemplars before them. There simply was no human agency that could exercise such control. Well, evidently, some monasteries would be more conservative in doctrine and attitude than others, and within a conservative monastery, an individual copyist could be committed to the divine authority of the exemplar he was copying. Apart from supernatural participation in the process, which I include, but most people do not, but apart from the supernatural participation, the prevailing attitude in certain monasteries, plus the personal conviction of individual copyists, is the only explanation that I can see for the incredible internal consistency that the Family 35 manuscript demonstrate. But I, of course, include the Holy Spirit's participation. But going on, why would anyone go to the extra work of adding a liturgical apparatus to a continuous text copy, since lectionaries were in plentiful supply? They're all over the place. And why was that apparatus added to only one text type? Precisely the one with the greatest internal consistency. Well, what would a conservative monastery do if it wanted to use the established lections for the reading aloud at the community meals? They do it today. I've been there. Every meal they read the text aloud. But doing so with a continuous text manuscript because of respect for the text. The beginning and the ending of the lections would have to be marked somehow. But respect for the text dictates that such lection markers must not be confused with the text itself. Therefore, ink of a different color, usually red, by the way, which would also help the reader to start and stop at the correct spots. Okay, well and good, but why choose Family 35 or KR? Well, if it is respect for the text that motivates you to use continuous text manuscripts rather than lectionaries, what kind of text are you going to use? If you are aware that the different manuscripts offer some differences in wording, how will you choose? I say that very awareness will derive from a conviction within the monastery as to which line of transmission within the manuscripts has the best pedigree. And it will be that line that deserves your greatest respect. 2 plus 2. So that is the type of text that you will use. But how is it that isolated monasteries during 5 centuries made the same choice? There's the rub. How is it that isolated monasteries made the same choice? Von Soden opined that a central authority ordered a revision and imposed it on the monastery. Since it is demonstrable that 535 or KR is not a revision, on what basis would that imaginary authority make a choice of what text to impose? I'm just using the hypothesis, okay. If that authority was a sincere Christian, would he not choose what he considered to be the best text? Since there was no such authority, we are still left with the question, how is it that isolated monasteries made the same choice? And I say they probably did not make such a choice. They simply continued the tradition that they had received from prior generations, going all the way back. And they all received the same tradition because there was a generalized conviction throughout the global Christian community as to the identity of the line of transmission with the best pedigree. Since the transmission of the New Testament text down through the centuries was essentially normal from the very start, the conviction about the pedigree would be based upon historical evidence. Of course, when the autographs were penned, there were no New Testament lections. Obvious. When the autographs were penned, the idea of adding lection markers had to come later. Just how much later, we have no way of knowing. Somewhere along the line, the first such manuscript was produced. Okay, was the idea so brilliant that it spread like wildfire? Or did the idea spread slowly? We have no way of knowing. However, whenever it was, those markers were added to the text type that was being used in the public reading, the public meetings. It should be obvious to everyone. I'm just about finished now, all right? It should be obvious to everyone that preparing a copy in two colors with an elaborate apparatus will take more time and effort and money than a copy in one color without that apparatus. So why would people do it? There had to be a demand for such copies, right? A manuscript with a liturgical apparatus was obviously prepared to be used for public reading, to be read aloud to an audience. For private reading and study, you want a text without such interruptions. Von Soden actually noted that the individual letters in his KR manuscripts tended to be somewhat larger than those in non-KR manuscripts. True, I've seen that. Oh, so why would that be? Well, presumably to facilitate public reading, right? In any case, books that are used wear out. So much so that monasteries that use a specific text type for their public reading would be sure to make and keep a number of backup copies on hand. There would not be the same motivation for text types that were not used. I say that is why, that may be why, Family 35 KR is by far the largest family within the Byzantine tradition. In the Gospel, at least 250, and the next one only has 100, if that much. It's by far the largest. And it is the only family that has so far been demonstrated to exist in all 27 books. That also is true. Just by the way, backup copies that were never used would have a good chance of surviving, right? Okay, to conclude, von Soden's characterization of his KR as a late revision is simply false. It follows that all informed persons should stop using the symbol KR. You should use family 35. If you don't want to do that, use family 18. It'll work. Okay, this concludes this list of videos analyzing the textual criticism of the New Testament. Next week, God permitting, I intend to begin with the life of Christ in chronological sequence. That's next week. But for now, that's it. Thanks for watching.